Canadian political leaders in recent election rallies have given lip service to increase Canadian Armed Forces funding. But none of them are talking about what's really happening in the Canadian Armed Forces. No one is talking about it. And what is it that they are not talking about? Why, COVID, of course. Because if they did, they would have to address that this issue, this issue, which continues to hamper Canada's ability to field a volunteer military, exists. So, what is it that they're not talking about? Well, there's an ever increasing refusal by state actors to take responsibility for their pandemic response, or in this case, the response to the jibby jabbed, injured Canadian Armed Forces members. That's right, they are being denied duty of care. This is Occam's razor. So, as I was preparing this podcast, there was yet another story that popped into the news about how the courts are refusing to take responsibility, or in this case, refusing to put responsibility where it lies. That the government are the ones who pushed this injection, and now they are claiming that they have no responsibility whatsoever for the side effects, the adverse events, the unaliveness, the injuries, and anything else that might have happened regarding the mandates. They are just not responsible. That's right. They have no duty of care. So currently in the Canadian Armed Forces, if you join, you will be subjected to CDS Directive 003 on the requirement to get the jibby jab. Not one shot, not two shots, but 3 shots you will need to take. Unless, of course, you're one of the colonels and above who managed to give themselves a religious exemption while denying religious exemptions to all their members who asked for them. But if you don't get the jibby jab when you join, eventually the only job you're going to be available to do, one that requires your skill set, will probably be to replace and top up the tampons in the tampon dispenser in the men's room. That's right, they're still doing that in the Canadian Armed Forces. But back to denial of care. So we do have Canadian Armed Forces members who were injured. A few stories have popped up. There are far more, but they're very difficult to find online. We have one story here. Former Canadian Armed Forces soldier. Look at the before and after pictures. This was the change in his health. 3 doctors confirmed the link. No duty of care by the Canadian Armed Forces. That's right. Here we have another example. Another Canadian Armed Forces soldier denied compensation for shot injuries. As a matter of fact, if you get out and you try to get some recompense for your injuries from Veterans Affairs, they too will deny you compensation, even though it was part of the job. In fact, Veterans Affairs of Canada has stated that injuries caused by the COVID jibby jab, because as I showed you, it's still a requirement to join, are not job related. I don't know how they came to that conclusion, but that's the current state of the Canadian Armed Forces. A couple of weeks ago, I was contacted by a friend of mine that I hadn't talked to in a while. He's still serving. He also has a jibby jab injury. And he was telling me a tale of one of his sergeants who was reporting to his duty station and talked to him and said, boss, I can't work. And my buddy asked him why. He goes, well, why should I? Why should I work for an organization that refuses to take responsibility for injuring its own members as part of the job requirement? To which my buddy said, I understand. Of course he understands, because my buddy himself has tried to get recognized for this particular injury that he has, and they refuse to. They refuse to. So I knew then and there that I had to do something. I had to put something online because most Canadians do not know that this is still going on. In fact, if the numbers are to be believed from Valor Law, and I do believe that her numbers are accurate, Valor Law, which is representing a host of Canadian Armed Forces members who are suing the department for either injuries or for being denied work because of the injection requirements. And they know from their own paperwork, from their own contacts within the armed forces, they're probably looking at that little number at the bottom of Monitor Mass or MCS to find out what the actual real numbers of the troops are. But apparently, according to Valor Law, 15,000 is about what we can field effectively, actual troops that are not injured, that don't have any issues, that are actually up to date on their training and deployment. That's a far cry from the 60,000 plus number that we had before they rolled out the jibby jab. This CDS Directive 002 on CAF COVID-19 vaccination, which is an implementations of accommodations and administrative actions. So back in 2021, we all remember that time. People were losing their minds. But for those in the Canadian Armed Forces, it was even worse because even though you had people taking it seriously outside of the military, within the military, they were losing their minds. And everything in the military is quite regimented. They were forcing us to wear masks, and then, of course, they decided they were going to force us to take this injection in order to keep our job. So up to this point, we knew that something like this would probably happen. In fact, there were rumors. In fact, the base commander had had a meeting with many troops on the base in a large area and mentioned that, if you don't get it, we're probably going to kick you out. And people started losing their minds. And as it turned out, the CDS Directive 002 did exactly that. So when they issued the directive, of course, the COs of each unit in order had to disseminate this directive down. Ours, of course, was done through email. People were all very much in fear. They did not want to meet anybody in person. They did not want to be in a room. They didn't even want to be in a hangar in a large area addressing the troops unless they were several feet away from each other. They were losing their minds. So here I have my email from my commanding officer. And as you can see, he's very, very proud that he has to do this. In fact, he has no moral or ethical compunctions whatsoever in pushing this. And of course, in there was a reflection of what was in CDS Directive 002, that those that are unwilling will most likely be restricted from accessing the base and subject to administrative measures. So here I was, a 38-year veteran of the Canadian Armed Forces, being made a second-class citizen already by the government, not being able to get on a plane or a train or a ferry or cross the border, provincially not able to get into restaurants or theaters or whatever other business they didn't want me into. 4 tours under my belt, 38 years of service, second-class citizen. In fact, the CDS directive here states that I'm not even going to be allowed on the base unless I get a shot. Now, of course, this was each CO's decision to make whether or not they want to let these people in. In most cases, they kept a lot of the troops away because they worked in areas and environments where they had to be in contact with other people. And of course, the military is bought in completely on the fact that they believe that this is much worse than it actually is. So obviously, you can't be on the base because you are a safety hazard. You're a disease vector because you refuse to get the injection. Now, I had my own office, so I came in and they didn't stop me. In fact, it didn't even stop them from coming into my office several times and having discussions with me, even though, according to them, I was a massively dangerous disease vector walking around. acting all healthy, like, refusing to get the injection. We have to ask ourselves, why? Why did they not make it an order? Oh, that's right. You didn't know it wasn't an order, did you? That's right. It was never an order. They never ordered a single Canadian Armed Forces member to get the injection. What they did do was create an administrative requirement. I know, it's a play on words, but you'll understand when I go through this. In fact, that directive right there, 002, stated specifically that once they were going to release you for not taking the jibby jab, they were going to make it impossible for you to ever work for the Canadian government ever again. And that's what this uh, release statement is here. The 4F, unsuitable for further service. Develops personal weakness or has domestic or other personal problems that seriously impair their usefulness. Not too useful. Now I'm completely useless. Now that I haven't taken the jibby jab, I was completely useless. All those aircraft types under my belt, 38 years of experience. I needed 2 more years to finish off a nice career at 40 years. It would have been a beautiful thing. It would have been a beautiful thing, but they took that away. Well, that's okay. That's okay. Things are more beautiful now. So let's go to the CDS directive and see what it says. The CDS directive 002 had very specific details that each member had to do. So we see here we have an attestation process. So Monitor to Mass, which is a program that everyone uses in the Canadian Forces, and it also helps to take attendance, so to speak. So we know, according to what the information is put in by the supervisor, who's at work, who's ill, who's not there, who's away. It's very, very good thing. So they added this attestation segment inside Monitor to Mass where everyone could put in there that they had either gotten it, or that they were going to get it, or that they weren't going to get it. And as part of that attestation process, according to the records, you had 2 weeks from the date given in the directive to get your 2 shots. And at which point of the 2 weeks, if you hadn't gotten it, well, the CDS directive was very, very specific. The administrative action that they would be doing on persons would be done through the initiating authority, which in this case is the commanding officer. He has the powers of punishment as granted to him by his senior officer. So what they would do to each member is that they would invoke DAOD 5019-4. DAOD, Defense Administrative Orders and Directives, has a very specific process that you're supposed to follow. But that's why the CDS added the notwithstanding. Oh, our Canadians, we sure love to use the notwithstanding clause in things, don't we? So let's go. Let's go to that DOAD and see what it says. So here we have our DOD regarding administrating remedial measures. And there's a very specific process that they have laid out in here, because over the years, remedial measures used to be a verbal warning, followed by a recorded warning, followed by counseling and probation. Each one had to be done one after the other. And this was to ensure that members were given a fair shake in dealing with the deficiencies, and also giving the supervisors an opportunity to properly escalate the issues with the members so that we can also deal with those issues and help the member to resolve them. But in this case here, that was not the purpose of the remedial measures. The purpose of the remedial measure was to coerce the member into taking the injection in order for them to keep their job. It was not to correct the deficiency. They only saw it as a deficiency because they knew that not taking it meant that the member had to be removed from the service. So it's very weirdly worded. And if you look at it and you follow it on a sense of ethics and morals, it was wrong. But if you follow it bureaucratically, like what they did it correctly. but yet they avoided answering and taking responsibility for their abuse of power by doing this. Now we go down in administering an IA, a remedial measure. You will see here that the IC, initial counseling, which used to be the verbal warning, is now initial counseling followed by an RW. But since the rules have changed, you can actually just give counseling of probation without going through an IC and RW. Or you can go straight to an RW and not do an IC first. It really is up to the supervisor. Well, in this case, it's up to the commander because they will be deciding in the end how this member is going to be dealt with. But you can see right here, IC or RW, minimum of 3 months and a maximum of 6 months. Right here, we can see CMP, 12 months for drug misconduct and 6 months to a max of 12 months for any other deficiency. So that's 3 months and 6 months. It'd be 9 months if they went for the minimums, but in accordance with CDS Directive 002, you were given 2 weeks to enter the information and monitor mass. You were given 1 week to get the jab after being given a recorded warning, and then you were given another week to get the injections after you were given counseling and probation. And after those 4 weeks were over, if you didn't get the jab, they were now forwarding your file to Ottawa, doing an administrative release in order to punch you out of the military with a 4F for not getting the injection. Regardless of your performance, your real performance in life, regardless of how many years you've spent in the military, regardless of how many tours you've had, regardless if you've saved someone's life in the military, regardless of how many honors you've had. In fact, the only people that were getting away with not getting the jab were senior officers who were giving themselves exemptions while coercing their troops into getting the injections. Why did they make this an administrative procedure rather than making it an order? Well, that's very interesting. Let's go through that. So in the Canadian Armed Forces, we have service offenses that can lead to courts martial, can also be brought up at summary hearings. And within these service offenses, there's actually one for injections and medical procedures. Refusing immunization tests and blood examination or treatment. Every person who, on receiving an order to submit to inoculation, reinoculation, vaccination, revaccination, other immunization procedures, immunity test, blood examination, or treatment against any infectious diseases, willfully and without reasonable excuse, disobeys that order, is guilty of an offense on conviction, is liable to imprisonment for less than 2 years. That's the military, if you refuse the injection. But they didn't charge anybody. In fact, they didn't use this service offense as a threat to make sure that everybody took the injection. I wonder why that is. Well, let's look at the notes here. The notes for this specific service offense state that no authority exists whereby a person can be forced to undergo inoculation. What? You can order somebody, but you can't force them? Well, let's read a little more. Although he can be ordered to submit himself to such a procedure, failure of a person to submit to inoculation, in spite of an order requiring him to do so, would constitute an offense on his part. Now, there's only one exception, right? Because we would state at the trial that this is unreasonable, which is why we would have a reasonable excuse. And this is what they were afraid of. They were afraid that if anybody who refused this order were taken to trial and they started providing reasonable excuses not to get the injection, then the people that were coercing them into the injection would have to answer as to why they were forcing them to get the injection if found to be unreasonable. And what charges could be laid on the people who coerced our members into taking an unreasonable injection? Well, let's look at that, shall we? I think the first thing is compulsion. Now, compulsion within the Canadian Armed Forces usually means that you talk somebody into doing something nasty. Defense may raise compulsion as justification, excuse, or defense if all of the following conditions are present. He received threats of immediate death or grievous bodily harm from a person actually present at the commission of the offense. Well, that would be the first reasonable defense, is that you're compelling me to take an injection that is proven to injure people. In fact, people were dropping in the news after the injections. People were having reactions to it. People were showing back at work after getting the injections, and they were having reactions. People were being hospitalized. These are facts. These are facts that they did not want to deal with in charging people for not getting an injection, which is why they made it an administrative procedure. Another thing we need to look at is abuse of subordinates. Abuse of subordinates. Every person who strikes or otherwise ill-treats any person who by reason of rank or appointment is subordinate to him is guilty of an offense and on conviction is liable to imprisonment for less than 2 years. So obviously there was a lot of abuse of subordinates. Valor Law, the two mass torts that they had that went to court, that got denied, that they are appealing, had very specific details of abuse of subordinates by their chains of command on these military members and how they dealt with them, how they treated them like second-class citizens, and how this very abuse of treating people differently within the Canadian Armed Forces because of their medical condition. I don't see how you can avoid saying that's not abuse. Next, cruel and disgraceful conduct. Cruel or disgraceful conduct. Every person who behaves in a cruel or disgraceful manner is guilty of an offense and on conviction is liable to imprisonment for a term not exceeding 5 years or to less punishment. Cruel behavior. Well, offenses including indecency or unnatural conduct may be charged under this section, but as a general rule should be charged under Section 130 of the National Defence Act, Section 103-61, offenses against other Canadian law. And this is to say that service offenses should be the offense prescribed in the criminal code. Oh, seems like this abuse can go a little further when you abuse your subordinates. And what kind of abuse did we suffer? You know, we all lived through it. We were all there. We saw how people were treated differently who didn't take the injection. And in fact, these specific requirements in some cases were laid out in policy. There were plenty of emails on what to do with people. In fact, just recording where we were in Monitor Mass as this thing was happening obviously stated that we were being treated differently. Very cruel, very disgraceful conduct by our supervisors in how they treated us in complete absence of moral and ethical values, especially the Canadian Armed Forces morals and ethics that they ignored in doing this. And now finally, let's look at conduct to the prejudice of good order and discipline. Everyone loves this one. Conduct to the prejudice of good order and discipline. So this is a catch-all. This is a catch-all charge they used to give, well, they still do, Canadian Armed Forces members. So you look at your specimen charges, you find out what they actually did, you give them that charge there, and then you give this one on top. It was just like an insistent add-on. In some cases, some soldiers will actually do something wrong, but the charge of what they did wrong doesn't actually stick. But they know it. They know he did something wrong, so they will stick him with this one here and still give him some kind of punishment, regardless. You're not getting away with it. If you've done something wrong, you're not getting away with it. So this charge here, they would have added on top of the one for not taking the injection. But in our defense, had they decided to charge us for listing unreasonable things that they had done to us, then this charge here would be reversed and put back on the person who charged us as well. I'm sure once the adjudicating officer would go in and look at all the evidence and find, oh, look, this guy's been abused and these persons were abusing him. Yeah, so we're not going to charge him with not taking the injection because obviously the system is wrong and unethical. Whereas the people who decided to put this charge on him, now we're going to have to look at them and see, perhaps we'll put on that abuse charge on them. And if we do, well, we're going to add this other one. You're not getting away with anything in the Canadian Armed Forces. If you're wondering why Canadians are not joining the CAF and why members in the CAF are leaving like there's no tomorrow, this is probably why. This kind of stupidity going on, whereby you still are coercing members into this injection that we know doesn't provide any defense from getting it and doesn't prevent you from spreading it, but yet you need to get it and has a list of known adverse events that most likely can happen. Of course, you would want to join an organization that forces you into this kind of medical treatment. Well, most people wouldn't. And the majority of the soldiers that joined that do believe in the Canadian Armed Forces ethics and morals know that this is wrong and evil, which is why they're leaving in droves, which is why, knowing that what the government and the military is doing to its members, are just reporting to their duty stations, marking time until they leave, because they have had enough of this. Let's not forget that this stupidity is not over yet for civilians as well, right? Because medical boards are quite happy to allow people to be unalived if they don't get the jibby jab, if they require an organ transplant. That's right, you're not getting one in Canada unless you've had the jibby jab. Let us not forget the National Citizens Inquiry continues today. Exposing truths and documenting facts, the state actors continue to dismiss as misinformation and deny Canadians engagement and accountability for those who abuse them. Or sorry, by those who abuse them. Let's not forget that other militaries have realized the harm that COVID-19 jibby jabs have done and have removed them, first by Florida State and then by the president. Now, this excerpt here from NATO Association of Canada article written by Razan Ganatra is replete with the same dismissive talking points regarding many things, but it does have some truth to it. And be aware that this info is now over 1.5 years old, and therefore the numbers will only be higher. Right, so a policy that was seemingly implemented for the greater goal of global health security unfortunately came with its own unwanted side effects. Due to the vaccine mandates, as well as a general dissatisfaction with military culture, the CAF is now faced with lawsuits, as well as a staff crisis, where 10,000 positions in the military remain unfilled. Now we know those numbers are much higher today. The long-term threat to the integrity of the CAF is that this precedent is undeniable and begs the question of how health policies can be better implemented. Huh. Are you serious? Better implemented? Well, the way would have been to stick to the actual directives, the actual National Defense Act. But the current government can't do that because when they came in, They had a mandate to both enrich themselves personally at the expense of taxpayers and change absolutely everything within Canada in order to ensure that that richness continued to flow to their pockets. That's right. Why? You think that this injection that they gave to the Canadian Armed Forces members that they paid for with your tax money was actually for health reasons? That's what they told you. But it seems that now that we're 3+ years down the road from this, I can't see how that's true. You can keep repeating the lie, but we can see the evidence in front of us. We can see the evidence in the Canadian Armed Forces. People are fleeing and people are not joining. I mean, aside from the having extremely crappy pay now, but even before that, if you really wanted to defend your country and you looked at the CDS Directive 003, you're like, whoa, maybe I'll wait. Maybe I won't join this thing. Maybe I'll leave the country and go somewhere else. Because that's what a lot of us are thinking now. So who is accountable? Well, we all bloody know who's accountable. Are the CAF doctors who are refusing to complete and sign off COVID jibby jab injury paperwork that we've heard about, that I've heard about directly from people I know in the Canadian Forces, that Valor Law has heard of from the people that they represent, because state actors, courts, and politicians who control them are afraid of what comes next? That the doctors will be the next scapegoats in this COVID enterprise? Is that who's going to be accountable? Politicians will never admit that their policies injured and unalived thousands, if not tens of thousands, of Canadians, numbers the government refuses to properly collect and provide. We know the numbers were higher. We know people were being unalived after one injection, but they were not considered jibby jab injuries or deaths because they never took the second shot. Maybe you didn't know that either. Because if you didn't take the second shot, you weren't considered jibby jabbed. That's right. You were still, like me, a second-class citizen in his own country, even if you were a veteran of 4 tours. Second-class citizen. So Big Pharma will dispatch their army of lawyers, and they will never face the consequences for distributing these injections. That only leaves one group to take the fall. Even if the medical board in your province threatened to take your medical privileges away as a doctor in order to comply with the COVID-19 jibby jab mandates, it seems that the doctors should have known this all along. So here's an excerpt from Dr. Philip McMillan's interview with lawyer Lisa Miron. I recommend you watch the whole video or watch the entire 29 March 2025 50-minute interview with Dr. McMillan. It's really interesting how this lawyer has gone through and sees what's coming next, because we know that the finger pointing is starting, and the first people that are going to be taken to task and making their responsibility and making them responsible for what they've done to us are going to be the doctors. This has been Occam's Razor. Please like, share, subscribe, and we'll see you next time. Enjoy the video, the short piece of it. Bye-bye.
The landscape of legal accountability regarding COVID-19 vaccine-related injuries is shifting. Traditionally, liability for vaccine injuries has largely fallen on manufacturers. However, recent developments suggest that individual doctors may face increased legal risks.
Canadian lawyer Lisa Miron has raised concerns about this shift, highlighting the potential for doctors to be held liable for vaccine-related adverse events. Miron points to a European Court of Justice decision as a potential harbinger of this change. While the ECJ upheld the authorization of COVID-19 vaccines, their ruling emphasized the responsibility of doctors to advise patients appropriately and potentially withhold vaccination in certain cases. This suggests a heightened expectation of individual doctors to assess and mitigate potential risks, potentially exposing them to greater legal scrutiny.
And I can't, provide an opinion in law in that respect, but I can give you how I interpret it. And the request was to withdraw the sort of the advertising or the presence of the shots on the market, and the court refused. And in refusing, they indicated something quite important. Two things: that doctors were always free not to administer the shots, and to advise against it. And in the second instance, that the doctor should have been providing prescriptions for this COVID vaccine. And so that's a lot to unpack, and there's a lot of directions we can go with that.
This shift in liability raises serious questions about the duty of care owed by doctors to their patients in the context of mass vaccination campaigns. Doctors are increasingly caught between following public health guidelines and exercising their professional judgment. This tension is further exacerbated by the fact that long-term effects of COVID-19 vaccines are still being studied.